Ladies and gentlemen, it is super hot outside, and if you live in Belfast, you know that most of these units don't have air conditions. So I have my windows closed or I have my blinds closed because how my room is facing, the sun is beaming in. But last night I did have some relief because I watched a video, I think a couple months back, or maybe that was like last year. I watched it twice this year and then last year, where there was a gentleman that said that if you put a pot of water in your room and you freeze it, that will like soak in all the heat and it will cool the room down. And that did work. That did give me some relief. So kudos to that person. This morning, I want to continue our discussion on transnational repression and delve a little bit deeply into the modus operandi of the Irish government and the United States government by uh, speaking specifically about how they perpetrate transnational repression. If you are new to the phenomenon of transnational repression, essentially is where states are using their diplomatic relations and their intelligence capacities to reach across borders to silence dissent of their citizens. When we think about uh, uh, diplomatic relations are embassies and consulates, and intelligence capacities are through its intelligence agencies as well as through non-state actors like cybersecurity agencies. In this uh, on this channel, I named a cybersecurity agency called Misuse Group Limited, who has connections to the U.S. government, and the evidence appears to be pointing to uh, the Misuse Group Limited engaging in acts of transnational repression along with the Police Service of Northern Ireland. But my focus today is about the modus operandi of political use of psychiatry or punitive psychiatry. And this is where the state will use psychiatry or mental health diagnoses for political reasons rather than a legitimate mental health reason. And you may say, well, Quianna, I thought that this only happens in the global south where persons are committed to mental health institutions for their political dissent. And you are right to some degree. The reason why we haven't seen enough people in the US or within Ireland being committed to mental health institutions is because of the robust legislation that both countries have. Uh, so we have Northern Ireland, or Republic of Ireland, USA. So these three countries have some legislation in place that does protect persons from being put into mental health institutions for political reasons, but that is not an argument that it does not occur. And so, building on this idea that states do use psychiatry for political purposes, it's important for you to understand how the U.S. government and the Irish governments uh, use it. And the way in which they make use of psychiatry and mental health is by mimicking and emulating the symptoms of a mental health disorder and putting those symptoms onto a person to discredit their testimony. And it's quite simple to do, I think, if you get enough people to sign on to it. For example, let's say, for instance, the state contracts with a group of thugs to thrash and beat and bludgeon a person on September the 24th. And then uh, come next year on September the 24th, another group of thugs thrash and beat and bludgeon a person or threaten to do that. Not they don't necessarily do it, but they threaten to do that, and that person reports it to the police, right? Well, the state could argue that that person is reenacting the symptoms of a mental health disorder, that they're experiencing a mental health disorder, um, that they're having flashbacks of that, and that discredits their testimony and also discredits the very fact that they have been victimized. And this is essentially what we're seeing with the US government as well as with the Irish governments. They are actively perpetrating uh, acts of, they're actually perpetrating acts that would be looked upon as a very significant human rights violation, but because of the state's uh, legitimate power, its referent power, its coercive power, most people would believe that their position is accurate when it's not. And so, what do I mean by that? I know that was not, I didn't say that quite eloquently. Well, the state has a lot of power, and the state can reward people for going along with a specific idea. The state can convince people to go along with a specific idea, or the state, by virtue of it being the state and being a political leader, people will believe what they say because they are in a position of power. And to prove my point, I want to I want to go through what Stanley Milgram found. He said that human beings are socialized to be obedient from an early age. We as humans feel compelled to comply with the commands of an authority figure. So if an authority figure tells us that a person is suffering from a mental health disorder, then a lot of people feel compelled to comply with those commands and not look further into it. And this is the important point that Milgram makes. He states that people do what they are told. And so if the state says, don't represent that person, if the state tells solicitors, don't represent that person, or if they tell human rights organizations, don't look into that person's case, or if the state tells uh, advocate groups, don't back that person, then people do what they are told because they are socialized to be obedient from a very early age, even when this conflicts with their own moral values. And so going back to the US and the Irish government's perpetration of transnational repression by utilizing the, or by emulating and mimicking and fabricating the symptoms of a mental health disorder, what I come to understand is that the state will schedule uh, its intimidation and its harassment around the same time. Let's look to my own case. In June of last year, the state withdrew my Section 95 support and didn't have any reason to do so. In October, I took that case to the Social Entitlement Chamber, who ruled that the state wrongfully withdrew my Section 95 support, found that I was not a failed asylum seeker, and ordered the state to reinstate my Section 95 support. The state did reinstate my Section 95 support, but what was important here is that there was no evidence that the state followed through on reinstating my asylum claim. And so, although it did reinstate my Section 95 support and did give me £200 in back payment, it never ever followed through on reinstating my asylum claim. So that was in 2025. Let's jump forward to 2026. In June, the state did it again. And you may ask, well, Quianna, why did it do it again? It did it again around the same time so that it can forward the argument that it's me that has a problem and not the state. And so, what I believe that it's doing, my theory here is that the state is once again formulating a false mental illness to say that, okay, well, this person is just reenacting what happened last year. And you see what that does is it prevents people, or it urges people not to look into the abuse, and it urges people not to look into the harm, because the state can say, well, this is just a reenactment of what the person experienced last year, and the person has a mental health disorder. But let me be abundantly clear. I do not have a mental health disorder of any kind. Let me restate that. I do not have a mental health disorder of any kind. This is the US government and the Irish government's punitive psychiatry, their political use of psychiatry to silence my voice and to isolate me, to ostracize me, and to prevent people from advocating on my behalf. And I don't need to convince any person to believe me. I care less whether or not people believe me, because the truth is going to come out sooner than later. Now, you may say, well, Quianna, you've said that for 3 years, and it seems like they silenced your voice. That's what happens. But the breadcrumbs are adding up, and you will soon see that the state is wrong here. And you will soon see that I am not the only person that they have done this to. They have done it to other people. They call it by different names because they can't bring themselves to call it for what it is: transnational repression. People can make up different other names to make themselves feel better. Intelligence agencies can create alternate names so they can throw it back on the person. But essentially, what it really is transnational repression. And so that raises an important question as to what happens when you put good people in a place that is surrounded by evil, right? Now, think of this Stanley Milgram experiment. You had participants that played the role of prison guards, and then you had other participants playing the role of prisoners. And what we've seen during this experiment is that the prison guards abused their authority. They, some of those prisoners went without food. Some of those prisoners were beaten, and it got really dangerous. And if I'm not mistaken, don't quote me on this, but I believe one person was really badly harmed to the point to where they had to be taken to the emergency room or even almost lost their life. And so Stanley Milgram states that what happens, let's raise this question again, what happens when you put good people in an evil place? Because we often think that a person is by its very nature a bad person when they enter a new environment. But what if that new environment is corrupt from the outset, right? And that these illegal practices have been within an environment for such a long time that it has become custom, tradition, and culture. And Milgram replies to that question. Normal, healthy people start to behave according to the social roles assigned to them. So here in Belfast, there are people that are assigned roles. There are people assigned roles as good persons, assigned roles as activists, uh, they're assigned roles as protectors, while other people are given other roles as the bad person, such as the prisoners, right? And those in positions of power will naturally use and abuse their authority. That's a natural phenomenon. And that is what we're seeing happen here, of course, in Northern Ireland, that's what I'm seeing as I look into this practice of transnational repression. Milgram also argues that those in a subordinate position will submit to authority. Well, some people will submit to an authority so that they don't experience any repercussions. But my question that I want to raise is what happens when they don't submit? And when they don't submit to authority, when they are uh, engaging in acts of nonconformity, which could be essentially uh, talking about human rights violations, then they could be put through transnational repression. And that doesn't happen to everyone. And I'll talk about that in another video. There's some uh, people traveling abroad and speaking out uh, that I want to point to demonstrate how other people can speak out against regimes and not be punished for it, while other people who do speak out against regimes are punished. And that is going to be probably a video essay, and I really want to work on that to do it justice so people don't take it out of context. But in the end, Milgram, what he does is he argues that it is the power of social situations rather than the dispositions of people that leads to their evil behavior. It is the power of social situations rather than the dispositions of people. So in this particular situation, let's look at the social situation. Here in Northern Ireland, it's very segregated, and it's where you have to really pick a side. There's two sides, and in my experience living here in 3 years, there's really not a middle side. So if you are not on the left side, well, I'm not going to use left or right, but if you're not on one side, then you could be ostracized and isolated. If you're not on the other side, you can be ostracized and isolated. And that is a breeding ground for confusion, distrust, and manipulation. Because, as Milgram eloquently put it, going back to that quote, it is the power of social situations that leads to evil behavior. So if a state is assigning roles to people and saying, okay, well, because we're assigning you the role of the protector of the people, we're assigning you the role of the good person, we're assigning you the role of a good immigrant, we're assigning you the role of a good minority, but then we're assigning you the role of a bad minority, or we're assigning this person a role of a bad minority or immigrant. We see, ladies and gentlemen, how that leads to evil behavior, right? And so I want you to really reflect on that and to really think about it, because I think that in this particular situation, the state is really abusing its power. Intelligence agencies are abusing its power because there are a number of grounds that they canvass to try and silence a person. The first is through use of psychiatry, punitive psychiatry, by arguing a person has a mental health disorder when they don't. That's one. If that doesn't work, then they move to something even more insidious by claiming that the person is violent, temperamental, and that is a frame all in and of itself. If that doesn't work, then they move it up more, right? And that is the person is a threat to national security. If that doesn't work, then they scale it back down to, okay, this person is not intelligent, they don't know what they're talking about. And then you can see it goes around in a cycle. And what they do is they recycle each of these uh, positions, or recycle each of these tactics to use against a person until one fits, right? And if one doesn't fit, they'll continue to recycle them until they silence the person for good. And sometimes that leads to the unalivement of a person. We've seen this happen all across the world, and I will continue to follow up on, or in our next video, we'll be um, referencing the Bullying and Sight book again, and how that does speak about how authority figures use bullying, and how that bullying can, at its most frightening, unalive a person. And we'll be referencing that in our next video. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. I'm sorry that this video was extemporaneous, didn't have a lot of time because I have an appointment I need to go to. And so we are going to talk to you next time. Don't forget to share this video. Bye-bye.